All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We have a few seats open in the front, and I would highly encourage people to come forward, just because the slides are going to be, the way they got the room set up, the slides are going to be a little difficult to see if you're sat right in the back corner there. So, you know, if you want to come forward, you'll probably find it a little easier, but it's fine. My name's Graeme Finley with Thornton. I'm going to be the facilitator for this morning's session. Thank you again for making some time. I hope you're all looking forward to having a little bit of fun with vendor management. I think we probably all have a common shared understanding of how important vendor management is in the delivery of large IT projects at the state. The state relies on vendors for a lot of the work that it does, and in many of these, particularly the larger IT-enabled projects, the performance of the vendor can make or break the success of the project. I've looked at the list of people who are registered, and I know for a fact that we have a lot of vendor management expertise in the room. And I'm not talking about me or any of the Thornton people, I mean you. And so what I really want this session to be is a conversation and a dialogue. We have some slides, and we're going to work through the slides, but it's going to be really boring if it's just me here talking for 2 hours. I think it could be really interesting if we can get a dialogue going around these topics. So I want to do a few introductions first. So I'm Graeme Finley with Thornton. I'm a director in our public sector consulting practice. I run our office here locally in Sacramento. A lot of the work that I've been doing with the state over the last several years has been around vendor management in one way or another. Prior to joining Thornton, I worked for one of the big system integrators, and so I have that sort of perspective as well as, you know, on the proposal development team and on the implementation team for the big implementers. I have Jeremy Blaine here, who's a colleague of mine from Thornton. He's going to be supporting some of the material. And then Diana Acuff and Amelia Butler in the back, who are going to be helping us as well. I've also corralled Mikkel Hammer, who is the head of vendor management for the Fiscal project, the statewide ERP project, to sort of be my foil during this. And so I'm going to be asking her basically for her opinion on a lot of the topics as we go through. She hasn't seen the slides, so she may or may not agree with any of the stuff that's up there, but that's fine. But the whole point of it is to sort of encourage a dialogue and get us talking.
That means Graeme is very brave.
Yes, or foolish, one of the two. This session's probably a little bit different to a lot of the others in that really what the session's about is a relationship, and it's a two-way relationship between the state, the government client, and then the vendor on the other side of a contractual relationship. And you know, it's a little bit odd in a way because everybody here, apart from us, are state people. And so it's a little bit like having a sort of a seminar on marriage, but you only allow wives in the room. There are no husbands allowed. So I guess we get to play sort of the husbands. What we really want to do, I think, from our perspective, is bring a little bit of that vendor perspective to the conversation. And what we'd really like to be able to do over the course of this session is help you think like a vendor. So put you a little bit into the heads of the way vendors react and behave. And sometimes there's a good reason for the way they do things the way they do. And talk about that a little bit and give you a little bit of practice of thinking like the vendor, because that, I think, can help to build a better relationship. You know, common understanding is always a good thing. So in terms of the agenda for today, talk a little bit of introduction and basics, and then we're going to go over two major topics. The first is around effective vendor management and monitoring vendor performance. And then the second is talking about dealing with underperforming vendors, but also talking about negotiation. And negotiation is a skill and is a practiced art that occurs a lot in dealing with a vendor relationship. So we're going to do a few slides on each one of those, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for discussion of the tables, where people can talk to each other about specific instances and maybe try and learn from each other. So that's the general background for the session. So the first thing I want to do, a couple of questions. Are there any specific topics or issues around vendor management that you would like to see really covered today? You know, anything that's sort of burning for you, or things that you really think the state has an issue with, or, you know, needs some open air discussion?
So I would like to talk about the difference between the art and the science, because we get really caught up, in my experience, with the science and forget the art piece. And I think a lot of times the art is what drives a lot of the success. So I would like to have discussion about that.
Okay, and that's a perfect lead into much of the topic. And you heard Carlos talk about it earlier, and Russ Hicks when he did his introduction. There really is sort of that, the whole thing about project management, the session today is around art and science, and this, I think, maybe more than any of it, that is true, because it really is about a relationship, and it gets sort of squishy when you start talking about relationships, but that's sort of the way the world is. So a question to you, just sort of a raise of hands. How many people here are actively involved in managing the relationship with the vendor in some respect right now? Okay. Or have been in the last, say, year or two? Okay, so that's most of the people in the room. For the people who are involved in an active vendor management relationship, how big are the projects? So if it's less than $5 million, put your hand up. Okay, a few of those. 5 million to 50 million. Okay, more than 50 million. Okay, we have some big projects in California. Okay, good. So let's go to the first topic. So thank you, Mikhail. Perfect lead in. Vendor management really is an art and a science. And I think there are a few themes we want to reinforce as we're going through the topic today. And in a way, where the starting point of our conversation really here is when you have a signed contract and you're now in the sort of management of that contractual relationship. But in many cases, that places the vendor management group almost as a victim of what happened during the procurement phase. Because you have to live with decisions that were made sometimes before you ever got engaged. And the kind of issues you can have would be whether the requirements were defined in a clear and unambiguous manner. You know, you have what I often call the oh, that's what you meant syndrome after the contract was signed, and you have to deal with that. There are risk allocation decisions usually made during the procurement process, where either the vendor or the state will take on certain risk or try and put certain amounts of risk on the other party, and then you have to manage that. And then if there's a real negotiation during the procurement phase, there's often trade-offs done with that. People will actually sit around a table and they will trade off things, and in some cases those things are completely unrelated, but you know, you want something, well, I'll give you that instead. And so you can get these strange setups in the contract where if you were just looking at it with a fresh eye, like, why on earth would we ever agree to that? It's because of something that happened 9 months ago during the procurement process, but you have to live with that, and that's part of the setup in a vendor management relationship. And so there really are two parts to it. There's the letter of the contract, which is sort of the science part. It's a contractual relationship. There are obligations defined in there. But then there's the day-to-day relationship. And you'll often hear the concept that, you know, as soon as people start pulling out the contract, that's a sign that the project is in trouble. You generally hear that a lot. I think there's some reality to that. But contract compliance is a key aspect and objective of good vendor management. And so you can't ignore the contract, it just can't be the thing that dominates everything else. I think that's sort of a signal of a healthy vendor relationship is when people can get beyond the contract, and even though the contract may say something, the two parties can come together for what's, you know, maybe in the best interests of the project, even if the contract doesn't say that. The second thing is around understanding incentives and accountability. And everybody has different incentives, and unfortunately the way contracts are set up, it almost encourages an adversarial relationship, because as much as you try and align incentives during a procurement, when you get to a contract, you have different incentives between the state and the vendor community. And Jeremy's going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the negotiation piece, but I think we all realize that. And you've sort of got to get past that, but the more you understand about what drives vendor behavior, I think the better you can manage the relationship. And so we want to talk a little bit about that as a theme. And then the final thing, and maybe the most important of all of them, is about open lines of communication, transparency and honesty. And if you have that, you can almost work through anything else. If people are really willing to talk to each other honestly, it's when people feel that they have to either disseminate or hide or spin the message that you've got some issues to deal with. So, Mikhail, do you have any thoughts about that?
And I would just say that the open lines of communication is understanding that at the end of the day, you really are on the same team. You're trying to have a successful project, and that includes having a successful vendor and state staff.
Does anybody else have any thoughts around, particularly on the incentives part? Have you seen examples where the vendor and the state team's incentives have really been truly aligned?
I worked on the statewide child support project, and the way that we aligned the incentives was that the vendor compensation was tied to system performance and to measurable outcomes related to that system performance. So, increased child support collections, increased fraternity establishment, those kinds of things, where they were clearly measurable, programmatically important things. The vendor didn't get compensated if we didn't see the projected improvements in those. So they were really incentivized to meet those outcomes, those objectives, and we worked together pretty well to accomplish those things.
I think that's a good example of where the state and the vendor were in a very long-term relationship that include delivering the actual sort of the solution in an operational capacity. So do we have anybody from FTB in the room? So I'm thinking that as another example of potential alignment of incentives because of the way the contract was structured. Would you agree? It's harder where you have, some of the more traditional procurements where the scope of the contract is basically building the system. Maybe you've got a warranty period, but then it turns over to the state. And so, a truly performance-based contract is harder in those environments. But that's certainly a good sort of model that really can help put everybody on the same page.